So I just wanted to welcome you all. My name is Kathy Szynski. I'm the General Manager in the Office of Student Publications, and I have been with Student Publications since the fall of 2011. I spent most of my career prior to that working at the Ann Arbor News on the business side in sales and marketing. So for those of you who were at the Daily in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, I was probably coming over to get ad copy for ads that the business staff sold when we would exchange ads that would run in the Ann Arbor News and in the Michigan Daily. So again, welcome. For those that have either attended a Michigan football game or are diehard sports writers and editors, I just want to thank you for being part of the largest group of Student Pub's alumni and friends gathered on Zoom this evening. So thank you. Before we proceed with the official part of the program, I do want to thank Lisa Powers for all of the work that she's done in putting this together this evening. I know putting together the, with the satellite reunions that are live in 5 different states is a certain kind of feat in and of itself. And having to pivot and do this all on Zoom is a very different feat. And I'm happy that Lisa was able to put this together, and I want to thank the alumni committee also for all the work that they have done in conjunction with Lisa. And so this is kind of a test in what fall might look like, right? We don't know what fall is going to look like on campus just yet. I'm hearing that the president Schlissel might be making some announcements early next week as to how things are going to happen for us in the fall. Everyone knows, I'm sure, by reading the newsletters and seeing posts on social media that the Student Publications building, the Stanford Lipsey Student Publications building, is undergoing some major renovations. There's no slate tile on the roof right now, and we are awaiting the new tile to come in. And there's interior work being done so that we can, have a very nice, clean, fresh start when we're able to come back in the fall, whatever that looks like. So I just, again, want to encourage those of you who have not been part of the alumni committee to reach out to Lisa, because she can definitely use some help in planning the fall events. Before I introduce Julie and turn things over to her, I think we've all undergone so many different emotions since this COVID-19 outbreak. There are days I know when I feel really angry about things. There are days when I'm actually peaceful about things. And there have been many days where I have been sad about different things that have happened. Right, and I would say one of the big things that really brought me to tears this spring was having graduating seniors come in and not being able to send them off the way we always do send them off. Got to stay within, keep a 6-foot distance, and not have them come in and have the building be locked and not have people in the building. And it was, pretty lifeless and pretty sad. So whatever you have chosen to bring with you to the event tonight, whether it's a glass of water or a cocktail or anything, whatever you have in your hand and with you, I do want to offer up a toast to this year's graduating seniors. I want to congratulate them for all their efforts and everything that they've given to the Daily, and can't wait to officially have you back in the building and be able to celebrate with you in a way that we should. All right. So at this point, I would like to introduce the moderator for this evening's first session, and that is Julie Rovner. Julie is the Chief Washington Correspondent at Kaiser Health News. She joined KHN after 16 years as a health policy correspondent for NPR. A noted expert on health policy issues, Julie is the author of the critically praised reference book, Healthcare Politics and Policy, A to Z, now in its 3rd edition. Julie also hosts KHN's What the Health podcast. She served as co-managing news editor with Rick Berke in the 70s. Those who know Julie or follow her on Twitter also know she's a horse person and a corgi mom. So Julie, I'd like to thank you for moderating the panel this evening, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for asking. The corgi is asleep about 3 feet away, and hopefully he will stay that way. The horse is not in the house. I am really honored to join you, and I'm very excited to see some of my friends, some of whom I see fairly regularly, and some of whom I haven't seen in a really long time. We have a really fabulous program tonight, plus a chance to visit with your favorite alums or even meet some new ones. We're going to start as this full group with a pair of speakers who will each talk for about 10 minutes. Then you'll be able to ask either or both of them questions. I assume most of you at this point are familiar with Zoom, if not completely sick of it by now. But in case you're not, please go ahead and make sure you can see the options at the bottom of the boxes, and make sure you can see the chat function, because that's where we will call on people for their questions. I would ask you to please keep yourself muted for the moment, and when I call on you, you can unmute yourself. Also, here's a little Zoom trick I only just learned. You can rename yourself so the rest of us can see your first and last name if you go up to the top. Anyway, if you want to rename yourself with your first and last name, because I know a lot of us have these names that are from our work and sometimes it's just initials. You can go up next to mute, hit those 3 dots. One of the options is to rename, and you can put your entire name on the screen, which would be very helpful. After our group discussion, we'll have 2 rounds of breakout rooms. I will explain more when we get there. Then we will come back together briefly and say goodnight. So let us begin. First up is Emma Stein. She's a rising senior and the summer editor-in-chief for this very strange and unprecedented summer. So she's actually coming to us from her parents' house, is that right, in California? During the school year, she's a senior news editor advising the administration and crime beats. Emma is studying political science and the program in the environment, which sounds very cool, and I hope she will tell us more about. So Emma, take us away.
Hey, hi guys. I kind of lost my voice somehow, so if you hear any voice cracks, just kind of move on. All right. So, hi everyone. As Julie said, my name is Emma Stein. I'm a rising senior studying political science and program in the environment. During the year, I'm a senior news editor for the admin and crime beats, or CRADMIN, as I like to call it. And this summer, I've been the summer editor-in-chief. And man, is it a wild summer to be in charge of a paper. I always heard stories about how fun it is to work for the Daily over the summer, how beautiful a summer in Ann Arbor is, how close all of summer staff gets. But I'm not in Ann Arbor. I'm in Los Angeles, thousands of miles away from pretty much everyone, and the closest we all get to hanging out is Zoom. And one other thing I want to point out is that being in LA means I'm not only thousands of miles away, 2,252 to be exact, I'm also 3 hours earlier. I'm leading a local paper that finds its heart and its news by being on the ground from a completely different part of the country. And while I live, breathe, and think in Eastern Standard Time, I'm still not actually there. We've certainly faced some struggles with time zone differences. I often will sleep through important texts or breaking news or staffers who need urgent advice. And there's nothing I can really do about it. I'm not a particularly late sleeper, but 3 hours in the world at the expectancy of lightning fast news is a lot. There is, of course, the added bonus that I finished 3 hours earlier. Sometimes I finish a production night at 11 p.m., which is wild. And when we put our edition out the first week of the protests, I finished at 1 a.m. my time, which is, not 4 a.m. The most important thing I think I've learned is that communication is key. And as cliche as that sounds, it's true. Even though our production nights are filled with texts and FaceTime calls rather than walking over to a section's desk or shouting across the newsroom, our communication hasn't slowed much. The only difference is we're not there in person with each other. And don't get me wrong, nothing compares to spending 8 hours a night with each other. The small talk and the times when everything is funny for absolutely no reason can't be replicated when we aren't all together. But we're finding a way to communicate and have fun while producing the best papers we can. Our biggest struggles this summer, though, have not been due to the distance between all of us. They've been trying to figure out what our place is in this all and how we can best serve our community with the voice and platform we have. Although the prompt for the speech was covering news in the time of COVID, it felt wrong to not address everything else going on. This summer is unprecedented. I've never experienced anything like this in my lifetime. Not only are we in the middle of a global pandemic that's killed over 115,000 people in the United States alone, but there have been mass protests about police brutality and systemic racism. People seem to have, understandably and rightfully, hit a breaking point. So where does that leave us as a paper, scattered around the state and the country, with a limited staff, curfews, and the world going up in flames? Journalism is more important now than ever, so the question we had to ask ourselves is, how do we continue to do our jobs of uplifting and amplifying the voices of our community? Let me start from the beginning. The summer began with this already transition to being entirely online. The during the year staff figured out how to go remote as soon as classes went online. And at this point in March, I still thought I was going to be studying abroad this summer. Fast forward a few weeks to an EIC election via Blue Jeans where my Wi-Fi didn't work, and I had to call Lizzie while she was on the video call on her computer, and she put me on speaker so everyone else could hear what I said. And then a few weeks later, I was in charge and had a group of managing editors who, for the most part, had never met me or each other. We initially ran into some issues with people who had Windows computers not being able to connect to the VPN or access the server. And so we had to set up a completely new system for them to use. Although it worked out, and it's actually pretty simple, my first week on the job, I was thinking I was going to have to do a complete overhaul of the process. Meanwhile, COVID-19 was running rampant. Cases in Michigan were skyrocketing, and each section had to find a way to adapt. Sports had no sports, video had no events to film, and photo didn't have much to photograph. A large chunk of our news coverage in the past has come from event covers, so we had to place an emphasis on longer, more in-depth stories. This actually gave us a chance to dive deeper into issues that otherwise might not have gotten as much attention. And, unsurprisingly, there was no shortage of things to write about. Whether it be groups combating anti-Asian hate in the campus community, Michigan medicine staff expressing their concerns about a lack of PPE, a graduate student union bargaining for their new contract, unemployment claims in Michigan, or virtual SACUA, because those never end as much as we all wish they would. Just because there was a pandemic, it didn't mean everything else went away, and it was our responsibility to make sure that we were still holding the university and the city of Ann Arbor accountable. There were a few protests happening around the state of Michigan fighting against the stay-at-home orders, and that was the first time I started thinking about the balance between covering the news and protecting the safety of our reporters. The reporters and photographers who went swore they stayed safe and kept their distance from everyone, but I was still concerned. No one at these protests were wearing masks, and videos were circulating social media about reporters being yelled at by these protesters, harassed even. I didn't want anyone on my staff to have to endure that. And then, before we could even blink, there was a protest in Ann Arbor every day, as well as all around Michigan, to protest not only George Floyd's murder and systemic racism, but police brutality in Washtenaw County from when a white officer repeatedly punched a Black woman and tased her husband. These protests are personal, they're emotional, and they're so important for us to cover. So at first we decided we'd cover all the ones in Ann Arbor, because that's where our coverage is based, and any other ones in Michigan we'd try to get to if we could. So we had reporters or photographers in Troy, Detroit, and Kalamazoo, to name a few. But then the protests just kept going on, and as reporters and protesters alike kept getting harmed or arrested, I was worried about sending our reporters out there. Some of our staff is pretty new and have only written a few stories, and covering these protests is unlike anything else. They're extremely long days that can be emotionally and physically exhausting. We had discussions about how to take photos to balance our First Amendment rights and, our duty to protect the protesters, and we made a detailed guide about how to cover a protest ethically and safely. This, again, is where communication has been our saving grace. Checking in on each other and being honest about where we are and what needs to be done is crucial during times like this. This movement also sparked an internal conversation about where we are as a paper in terms of diversity and where we need to do better, and how we can use the voice we have to enact real change. Our news staff has been killing it at protests. One of our news editors, Claire, stayed until the very end of a protest in Troy. So when other outlets left earlier and reported that the protest ended with officers kneeling in solidarity, we reported that actually many stayed behind and officers threatened to arrest them. We're committed to getting the full story, and that's been shown in our coverage. By being the first there and the last to leave, we uplift the voices that matter. Our opinion and Michigan and color sections are working together every week during edit boards, discussing a new topic related to systemic racism every time, and it will culminate in a final body of work inspired by the New York Times' 1619 project that will include a detailed history of how we got here and actions our readers can take going forward. This summer has been unprecedented. There's a global pandemic, there are mass protests, people are demanding equality in a way I've never seen before. But there's also still local issues that need our attention. There's a Twitter account that's anonymously accused hundreds of community members of sexual assault. There are new clauses in housing contracts to account for COVID-19. There are unions bargaining. There are city council elections in August. There are new Title IX policies. There are student groups on campus doing wonderful things. And we're still waiting to hear a flow of in-person classes in the fall because first and foremost, we are all students. So we're covering news in the time of COVID the same way we cover anything else. We're all just taking it one day at a time, working to serve the community, keep ourselves relatively sane, and do the best we can to amplify the voices that matter. That's it.
Sorry, I was slow to unmute. Thank you, Emma. That was very nice. I'm about to introduce Rick, but if you have questions for Emma or Rick, you can start leaving them in the chat. So when they're done, I will have people to call on. So next up is Rick Berke. Rick is the founder and executive editor of Stat News, a biomedical life sciences and health website under the umbrella of the Boston Globe. Rick was managing editor of The Daily in 1979 and 80 with me, where we served, and spent most of his career at the New York Times, where he was national political correspondent, among other reporting jobs, as well as Washington editor, national editor, and assistant managing editor. Rick comes to us tonight from Boston, and he's going to talk about what it's like to cover COVID-19. Rick.
Thanks so much, Julie, and thank you all for having me. And Emma, that was just terrific. I mean, and thank you for carrying on the tradition under most unusual circumstances from California that I can't even imagine doing that. So hats off to you. And just by way of background, how the years and decades have flown by. My first year or so at The Daily, as well as Julie's, we printed the paper at 420 Maynard on actual linotype machines. And I'll never forget when I visited The Daily a few years later, and there were no people were on computers, and I told the editors, I said, "Boy, I remember when there were typewriters," and they looked at me like I was like from the Stone Age, from the Flintstones or something. It was just really something. So time marches on. As Julie said, I graduated with her from Michigan, actually graduated from The Daily because that's really where I spent most of my time in 1980, and then went on to the Evening Sun in Baltimore, and then about 28 years at the Times, and then I was editor of Politico before starting Stat about 5 years ago. And unlike Julie, I had no illustrious background or any real background in health or science coverage. I was drawn by our owner's mission, which was that there was a market out there for a digital publication or another digital publication with tough-minded journalism about health, medicine, life sciences. And what we try to do at Stat is take readers inside academic labs, biotech boardrooms, political back rooms, try to puncture hype and cast a critical eye on everything from scientific discoveries to corporate strategies to battles for talent, money, and market share. And it's interesting, one of my reasons for going to Stat in the first place, it was a kind of a tough decision because I moved from DC to Boston, and I thought, what do I know about starting a startup? What do I know about health and medicine? But I was visiting The Daily when I was still editor of Politico, and I was in the library looking at old bound volumes, as many of us do when we go back to The Daily, looking at my old bylines. And I started chatting to with one of the reporters there, and I gave him my card and forgot about it. Then about a year later, he sent me this long note saying, "I know you're a political journalist and you don't know anything about science, but I really want to be a science journalist. And can you give me any advice?" And it so happened that at that moment, I was in negotiations with my owner, John Henry, about starting Stat, which didn't even have a name then. And I saw this note from this Daily reporter, Ian Dillingham, as sort of a sign that I need to do this. This guy, Ian, will be like one of my first hires. So I actually brought his memo I said, "Give me a story memo, Ian, and I brought it to John Henry, my owner, and I said, I think I should do this. And so Ian was Stat's first intern back 5 years ago. And let me just say that this horrifying pandemic has reaffirmed the value and mission of what we do at Stat. Our infectious disease reporter, Helen Branswell, first tweeted about what became known as COVID-19 last New Year's Eve, and she was the first US reporter to write about it. And for our staff, since then, it's just been nonstop. It seems like suddenly the sometimes seemingly obscure topics that we cover have been front and center. It's, you know, our reporters have been writing for years about viruses, vaccines, public health, drug development, clinical trials, disparities and outcomes. And it's great to see the audience coming now to us. Our readership has grown by literally tens of millions. And we do this with a staff of about 30 journalists. And we try to be targeted and we want to keep ahead and keep up with the major, bigger outlets, but we also try to keep our focus on the core audience of our readers who work in the worlds of health and medicine. And so we try to both be credible to them and interesting, provocative, accessible to a broader audience of people who are new to these subjects. And so we pick our spots and leverage our sourcing in these areas: public health, pharma, biotech, academia, healthcare. We were one of the first outlets to write about flattening the curve, the months of magical thinking, how ventilators are being overused, the validity of so many of the serology tests on the market. We've written stories looking, you know, months ahead of scenarios of how the pandemic would play out from a health and science point of view. We've written a lot about the disparities and why Black and brown communities are particularly hard hit. Our truth squatting stories on the potential for specific vaccines have swayed hundreds of billions of dollars. And I'm literally, this is really true, hundreds of billions of dollars in stock market value for biopharma companies. Our Helen, who I mentioned, our infectious disease reporter, she was looking at on Bloomberg and CNBC, they showed the stock falling billions of dollars. She said, "This has never happened to me when I cover public health. What's going on here?" We try to steer clear of the stories that everyone else is doing, like the disarray in the White House and reacting to the pandemic. You know, when I was at the New York Times, I was one of the editors that would either write or throw dozens of reporters on those, what we call TikToks, to sort of say, how did this happen? Take us inside the White House. But without those kind of resources, we instead look to be smarter and sort of more targeted than the bigger competition. This evening, just a couple hours ago, for instance, we posted a story on how public health experts say Trump's dismissal of the pandemic, he said last night that it's quote unquote dying out, could have real consequences in drawing out this whole pandemic. The story today was co-written by Lev Fasher, who's one of our DC reporters, who was on this call because we recruited him after he graduated from Michigan in 2016. He was managing editor of The Daily. So I hope, Lev, wherever you are, take a bow for that, for joining Stat. So many news organizations have done amazing jobs covering this pandemic. Obviously, Julie and Kaiser and my former colleagues who are Lenny Bernstein at the Post, Joyce Frieden, who's on this call at the MedPage Today, and many others. The challenge for all of us in covering this pandemic is, frankly, doing the opposite of what we're hearing from the White House. It's reminding the public in a broad way that this pandemic is not going away. It's much easier to report on a pandemic at the beginning than it is now, where, you know, people sometimes get bored of the story. So we have to find new ways of new angles and new ways to tell the same story that we've been all telling for months. Sure, we wrote about the scenarios, 3 months ago. So we have to do that again in a fresh way. We have to write about the vulnerable communities, who they are, who's most affected, and how that's changed since we first wrote about it 3 months ago. So we have to just keep at it. And we have to also power through our own exhaustion and stay engaged ourselves, even as these other historic stories, notably the worldwide reckoning over racism, as that story rages around us. I feel that we're fortunate, all of us covering this pandemic, we're fortunate to have a mission and a purpose at this surreal time in our history. And I also personally feel very lucky to have spent these last decades building on everything that I learned at the Daily. And I see that in what Emma is talked about. And I don't know, Emma, if you're going into journalism, but all the skills you're learning, all the conversations you're having in your in the Daily newsroom now over Zoom about diversity and all these issues are conversations that we're having at STAT that every newsroom is having in the country. So I'm thrilled that we can all kind of share our own experiences together. And thanks very much.
Well, thank you both. That was cool. I'm starting to get some questions in the chat. Yes, thank you. I'm hoping that that we'll get some more. I will, as long as Rick is doing a shout out, I'm going to do a shout out too at Kaiser Health News. Emery Hudeman, one of our Washington reporters, is an ex-Dailyite. I don't know if she's with us tonight. And our intern this summer is Lizzie Lawrence, the current editor-in-chief. And unfortunately, because we're not in the office, she's not in the office. I know she's in New York, but I'm hoping that before the summer is over, we can actually be together in person. Emma, there's a bunch of questions for you. Actually, Sarah Fitzgerald, you had two good ones. Why don't you unmute and ask them?
If I can remember them both. The most recent one was just as Rick was talking, does the Daily have any reporters assigned to the University of Michigan Medical Center now? Back in my day, I'm sure we didn't really, unless there was some sort of intern action organizing, or of course, we all remember the breakthrough of the Daily in terms of the announcement of the Salk polio vaccine, which some people have noted during this time. So just a question in terms of how you deploy in terms of the intellectual capacity of the university and keeping on top of that.
We don't have a specific reporter assigned to the medical center, but we do have a research beat. And so those are two reporters. This past semester, I think we're both neuroscience majors and maybe other things too. And so they focus mostly on, what the hospital was doing for COVID and stuff like that, but not a specific reporter.
And Sarah, your other question was about what she knows about the university reopening. What, any scuttlebutt from what you think is going to happen, and will there be sports?
Okay, well, I think it's going to be some form of hybrid, because I think it was the Wall Street Journal article, Schlissel said that there weren't going to be sports if there weren't students on campus, and sports, the athletic director had a press conference today and they were already moving student athletes back to start training. So if they weren't going to have other students come back on campus, I don't think they'd start doing that. And so I think they're going to try to do some form of hybrid like most other schools are doing and see how it pans out. But hopefully we'll get an announcement soon.
Linda Drieben, you have a question for Rick. You're gonna have
Yes, Rick, wherever you are. I was just wondering if from your reporting you've started to see any evidence or indication of spread of the virus from the protests, which would seem to be quite likely if it spreads as we all understand. Or is it too early to have that sense?
I mean, you hear it anecdotally, but I think it's too early to have any real sense of that. But it stands to reason that the infection rates have gone up, in recent weeks. So it's either people going outside for Memorial Day or not taking this seriously or being in large crowds. So I think it's a safe bet to say that that certainly helped spur or spike the numbers, but we don't really know. And there's so many questions with this pandemic of so many, it still seems like we know more than we have more questions than answers on so many basic questions about this pandemic.
Joyce Frieden, you had a question for Emma and a question for Rick. Two different questions.
Right. So do you want me to do them both?
Sure.
Okay. So first for Emma, you mentioned about diversity, and I was curious about what the daily newsroom look like now in terms of diversity and what you might be trying to do to increase it.
Yeah, I don't know the exact numbers. I'm working with our access and inclusion chairs this week, and we're going to send out, hopefully in the next few days, a demographic survey so we can get a better sense of where we're at right now. We did one last year too, but I don't know those numbers. Just from being in the newsroom over the past 2 years, I've seen us get more people of color, especially on the news section, which is super important. And we're also just working, I think, on repairing and like really enforcing and having strong relationships with different multicultural groups and stuff on campus, and making sure that we're advertising and demonstrating that we're like an open and platform that wants to help them amplify their own voices. I guess if that helps.
Very good.
Very white newsroom. So.
Right. And Rick, I asked who you see as the audience, primary audience for STAT.
Well, it's interesting. It's sort of changed a bit because our core, we have STAT, which is which is for a free general audience, and we have STAT Plus, which is our subscription service. And we decided very early, like in early January, I think before the Times and many other places, to make our coronavirus coverage free because as a public service, and we figured let's cross our fingers and hope we can still have a sustainable business model, because our core paying subscriber audience are people in fields of health and medicine and life sciences, and sort of the fields that intersect those, like some of the legal fields and PR and so forth. So by making it free, we've sort of enlarged our audience, and we've attracted a much bigger, sort of broader public health audience and a more general audience. I still think our core audience of people who keep coming back to STAT and read us every day are people that have a more than cursory interest in these issues. But I think because of the pandemic and because we've made it free, we've built out our audience, and also we've enlarged the people even in medicine and health who didn't really know we existed, who are now subscribers.
Having a feature about you in the New York Times probably didn't hurt.
Right.
Al Fanger, you had a question.
You have a question for you, Julie, and Rick, and Joyce, and all of you who are doing such yeoman's work covering the pandemic. So my question is this. I'm looking on my phone. It looks like in the last minute, we've reached 7,655,000,000 plus people on this great earth. If we're going to have a vaccine, it seems to me that we have to have enough medical glass to be able to produce, that gargantuan a volume of glass. We have to be able to have facilities large enough to brew the vaccine, realizing economies of scale. And then we have to have an efficient delivery mechanism in order to push the vaccine out to that many people. Tell us what you know about how daunting a task that might be, because we all know, we read various accounts of how short or long it might take to actually have a vaccine that's both safe and effective. But it seems like the great untold story is the logistics behind that effort. So be interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, I can start on that. And I would say, and I'm sure Julie and Joyce would have much to add. I would say that's something that we've repeatedly been writing about. There's no magic snap your fingers vaccine. And first of all, even if you had a vaccine, it may not be 100% effective. Look at the flu vaccines that aren't effective. So there's not even, there's no guarantee that a vaccine would be some panacea, first of all. Second of all, the distribution, first of all, developing it. Can we really develop a vaccine that works, or that even works, you know, two-thirds effective? And then you have the question of, and I do believe, because of this race to move fast, I do believe there's a chance they could develop something maybe by the end of the year. But it's a whole nother question. First of all, will that be a successful vaccine? And the whole question you raised about logistics and accessibility, like distribution and who would get it and how much would they have to pay for it. There's huge questions. And you know, you hear the president talk about the AIDS vaccine. There's no AIDS vaccine. We have to remember that this vaccine business is really, really hard.
Yeah, if I can add to that, actually, a little pitch for today's What the Health podcast. We actually talked about a Politico story that was in today's Washington Post also about what happens if the president is so desperate to get a vaccine out by election day that they end up putting out a vaccine that either doesn't work or has serious side effects. What will that do to the already very tenuous trust that the public has in public health in general? I mean, that there's a worry about getting a vaccine out too fast, in addition to the worry about getting a vaccine out not fast enough. Joyce, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, actually, I was covering a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing today, and they were talking about consortiums in Europe of companies, different companies that are countries that are trying to develop vaccines. So I would have a hope that first of all, there might end up being more than one company that comes out with something that's safe and somewhat effective, and that they might have kind of cooperative agreements as far as manufacturing. So it wouldn't fall on one entity to do everything.
Liba has a question for Rick, but first I actually have a question for Emma, because I wanted you to elaborate. You talked about the Michigan in Color doing something about sort of akin to the 1619 project, and I want to know more about that, since that's the other sort of big story of the summer.
Yeah, we haven't fully fleshed it out yet, but basically we felt like we needed to do more than we have already. And so they came to me and my managing editor with the idea to sort of create a special edition like we do the graduation issue or the orientation issue or the new student edition, but one dedicated just to systemic racism, so we can really put that out there. And so we're going to do that. So far, there have been 2 editorials where Opinion and Michigan in Color collaborated. You should all go read the most recent one. It's very thorough, very good. They're all well researched, and they're sort of just, and then we're going to try to get all the sections involved. So looking at, you know, how sports and how that, you know, has played into systemic racism and stuff like that, and how sort of trying to tie in all different sections and news with current events to sort of, it's something that needs to be talked about. So we're just trying to do it.
I would love to see a history of race at the University of Michigan, just using the daily archives. I think would be
that'd be interesting. It's a good idea.
Lipa, you have a question for Rick. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Hold on. Did that work? Yeah. Or it could be for Julie as well. First of all, there is a book about racism in sports at the University of Michigan that goes to about 1976, but that's not the question. As someone who has the possibility of coming down with severe COVID-19, I've been following it very thoroughly. So Julie or Rick, people in nursing homes have a really high rate of death, which is like absolutely horrendous and horrible. But the one statistic I have not heard about is how many of those people who died had a DNR. which meant that they may have recovered if they didn't have a DNR. And it's just something that has always like hit me, because my mother had a DNR, and it wasn't from that. She had like, a bad flu or whatever, and they just, gave her medication to, soothe her down. So my question is, what about the DNRs at the nursing homes, and does that affect the numbers on the death rate at the nursing homes?
That's a very good question. I don't know. That's a very good question to ask. We've written a lot about, not a lot, we've written a very deep story about how COVID has changed some people's decision-making about getting a DNR or not. When they see that you can sometimes come out of this okay. And we've talked to some elderly patients, people about sort of the rethinking of this whole question. But whether that's leading to more fatalities, I don't know. Julie or Joyce may.
No, I agree. It's a really good question. And I also don't know. I think it will be, obviously, there are, decisions about, there are also family decisions about, putting elderly people on ventilators. I mean, it's really sort of the ventilator decision. There are obviously stories coming out about very elderly people. There's a woman who was 100 who got COVID and recovered. So, I mean, it's really the big question is, do you actually go to the ventilator? And that's, I have not seen statistics. I don't know that we have statistics that most of the statistics we get about nursing homes come from CMS, and I'm not sure they require sort of that level of detail to be reported. Joyce, do you know?
No, I don't know. And I think one question that this raises is, I assume ventilators would be included in the DNR order when you specify what kind of treatment you do and don't want, but I'd be curious to look into that too.
And Liba, my colleague Lev just posted in the chat room that the story we did about cancer patients reconsidering their end-of-life wishes, and it was a really compelling, fascinating story that I'd recommend.
You mean from Lev, the former Chronicle sports intern?
Lev, it wasn't written by Lev, but he just heard the discussion, just posted it.
Okay, I think our next question comes from Max Kwong. Max, are you there somewhere?
I'm here.
Unmute yourself. There you go.
Here. First of all, thanks Emma, Rick, and Julie for the talk. For Rick, so a question about covering the academic side of things and like the public health side of things. How do you convince like the academics and healthcare professionals that to really share their research and stuff to the broader audience while still maintaining like a very nuanced, the scientific nuance? Because when I was at the University of Michigan, I worked in the chemistry lab, and there was always this they were us, they were them, and we were us kind of mentality to like, journalism or like broader audience people, and then the researchers, scientists, healthcare professionals. How do you try and bridge that gap? And has COVID, now our our collective feeling of that made it easier?
I would think that with COVID, what researchers and scientists do is more, should I say, in vogue or of more interest or more relevant to people. It doesn't feel as foreign or distant to people, and people understand more of what researchers do. And I think, and I'd like to think that people in research understand that and want to share their work. And it sometimes is a challenge for our reporters when you're interviewing people in this world to sort of pull out of your narrow research and explain it to us in a way that is accessible. And our senior science writer, Sharon Bagley, had some great quote from a scientist the other day, and I said, "How did you get that quote?" She said, "I just told the scientists sort of, this is boring, sort of explain it so people can understand it." And I think it's a challenge for any reporters covering this to sort of to make the case for people we're interviewing to share the research, make it accessible. We have something we call First Opinion, which is our like op-ed section, and we run a lot of pieces from people in the world of science and medicine, and we're forever like going back and forth saying like, this isn't English, you've got to make it understandable and accessible.
I feel like one of the big problems we're having right now is the opposite. It's researchers making information accessible when it's research that's not done. It's not only not peer reviewed, it's all of this preprint stuff, or
Right.
you know, the information on dexamethasone in England, which, as some pointed out, was really just a press release. It wasn't even a study. So I mean, this is sort of, you know, researchers are generally so careful not to talk about the research because it would jeopardize its chance for publication. Now we're having sort of everybody throw everything up against the wall and see what sticks.
That's exactly true. And one other thing that we're finding since this whole pandemic started, we're inundated every day by people in the so-called worlds of science and medicine who want to be quoted, who want to be seen as experts. And many of them, if not most of them, have no credentials to be quoted, have no public health credentials. They just want the attention. So I think part of what one thing we offer at STAT is reporters that know this world and have trusted credible sources over the years, and they know who to take seriously. But I worry about at some of the more general interest publications, if you haven't covered these stories or public health or vaccines, and you don't know the ins and outs, you can get hoodwinked by people who are offering themselves to be quoted.
Yeah, and Max, I also wanted to just mention you should look up the Ingelfinger rule, which allows scientists to talk about their work to trade or general news publications and not jeopardize their chances for getting it into a peer-reviewed journal. So sometimes it's helpful to cite that if you're interviewing somebody and they're reluctant to share their information with you.
We've got a couple of questions about politics. We're running out of time, so if you could keep them brief, we can sort of bunch them together. Kevin, why don't you start with yours? You have to unmute yourself, Kevin.
Sorry, working on two monitors. Rick, I think you said that you avoided certain political coverage and just because of resources, but how much pushback do you get from your subscribers, which is something I think you can measure in a digital publication? Do they want to hear about, I don't know, Trump administration untruths, or are they more interested in just core science?
Right. No, that's Kevin. First of all, great to see you.
Good to see you.
That's a really good question. I'm at a core as having covered, you know, like, you know, I don't know, 6 or 7 presidential campaigns, or I don't know how many. I'm sort of at the core a political reporter, and so, and I'm sure my colleagues at STAT kind of like roll their eyes when I try to turn so much into a political story. And thank God Lev on this call is one of Lev's main beats is to cover the intersection of politics and science. And so what I think what people come to us for, I've learned, is not the politics, but really our expertise on the science and the health. But what I try to do is sort of marry the two whenever possible. And one of my favorite pieces that we've ever done was 3 or 4 years ago, like 3 years ago, when I was sort of dying to find a way in to cover Trump. And Sharon Begley did a story that was really based in science, that only a real science reporter could write the way she did, which was comparing Trump's speaking style and speech patterns from today compared to what they were 20 years ago. And we used lots of video, and it was just a really compelling story that still gets readers now. It was sort of the definitive story that you could see. It wasn't just political posturing, it was a definitive science story about Trump's speech patterns and how they've dramatically changed over the years and why that might be. And I'd like to think that when I was a political reporter, if I had been assigned that story, I could have done a great job on that, but I couldn't have. And I think very few people would have known how to write the story that Sharon knew how to do because she understood the science. So I think people come to us for that credible science expertise and not the politics. And we, again, find a way to engage the two. And one thing that I'm kind of happy about is whenever we write about anything that veers into anything about Trump, even if it's founded in fact-based science, we get this deluge of, it gets picked up by Drudge, and we get like huge blowback from people saying we have a political agenda, and it makes me so glad we're not covering Trump front on like the Washington Post or the New York Times or other places, because it's really I think of what Maggie Haberman is going through, what you have to deal with the attacks and the criticism. It's nice to work for a place where mostly we can focus on the real life facts and science.
Just a brief follow-up with that. In terms of reporting on pure science, when there are responses from the government that sort of reject pure science, do you cover that, and what's the response to that?
Yeah, and I didn't fully answer your question. And I don't mean to say we totally steer away from politics. We don't at all. Politics infuses everything, and I think one way I think we stand out is we know how to write about both in an intelligent way. And I think we'd be doing readers a disservice if we tried to not give the political context of what we're writing about. And one example is the story I mentioned that Lev did today, that wasn't a straight political story, but it was founded in politics. It was about Trump is saying all these things that are untrue about this pandemic. And we don't want to track every day, every utterance of Trump, but once in a while, but we need to hold our politicians and our scientists accountable. And so if we can look at it through the lens of public health and of science and say, here's what public health experts say about what Trump is saying and how his messaging can actually practically affect this pandemic and how it plays out, that's the sweet spot of why people would want to read a stat story.
All right, well, it is time to go to the breakout rooms, but before we do, I want to get one more question in because it's actually to this exact point. So Claire Howe, do you want to ask your question, which obviously is a follow-on to what we were just talking about?
Yeah, sure. So I was wondering, since COVID-19 has kind of become a partisan issue, if you feel like, because your news outlet bills yourself more as a facts and science focused outlet, if you feel like you can reach people who may be skeptical of outlets like New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, and if you just how you dealt with having more readers who may come from, may have left those outlets to yours.
No, Claire, I feel really heartened by that, because we have people who come to us, and really, I mean, our reporters are people, especially in a pandemic like this, as Julie and Joyce knows, it's not like when there are other historic stories at the New York Times when we were covering 9/11, you throw 1 million great reporters on it, and they do great stories. But when covering a pandemic, this is really tricky territory. And certainly I could not cover this. I know who to hire that knows these subjects, but I couldn't cover them. But if you have people like Helen, who's spent 20 years covering infectious diseases, and people like Adam Feuerstein, who have covered biotech, and Ed Silverman, who have covered pharma for years, you know what questions to ask and you understand how vaccines work. And so I think what we have going for us is the credibility of people who are writing about these. And sometimes I'll get I got a letter, an email recently from a reader who's saying, you guys are just becoming political. They see like one or two of these stories where we talk about Trump. You guys are becoming political just like everyone else. And I sent this woman a note back, because I always like to respond and challenge the readers. And I essentially said, how dare you say that? Name me one more credible place where you're going to find this fact-based coverage. And she backed down. So I think, so I'm continually sort of reminding people it's easy to just point fingers and say you're political because you mention Trump, but facts are facts.